Well, hi everyone. Welcome to Ask and Wonder, the show that brings Christians and skeptics together to talk about the big questions in life. Very excited. As you know, I always get very excited about conversations. Today, we are tackling one of the questions. It's a question that many people have. I sometimes still think about it. And today's question is this: God is love, but what about the Old Testament? And in order to tackle this question, we have with us Brian Sigmon. He is a PhD in Old Testament studies from Marquette University. Very excited to have you here. How are you, Brian?
I'm just fine, Pedro. Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate the invitation and really look forward to our conversation this afternoon.
Definitely. I'm very excited too. And definitely, actually, let's just jump right in because I'm ready to have this conversation. I've been looking forward to this one. So before we get actually into the conversation itself, would you mind, Brian, sharing a little bit with us about your journey in the Christian faith? Have you always
Yeah,
been a believer?
I have actually. Yeah, I appreciate that, and you'll have to stop me if I go on too long because I appreciate the opportunity to talk about my and what it's meant to me. I've been a Christian my whole life. I was raised in the United Methodist Church, and I have never left that tradition. Um, but I say for me, the Bible has always been an important foundation for my faith, maybe more so than most. And study of the Bible. I tend to be a very intellectual person, and the reading the Bible and studying it deeply, asking hard questions of it, especially when I got to college, became a very important part of my faith. I was all of a sudden introduced to historical, critical, literary reading of the Bible, and for me, I know for many people that can present a challenge to faith, but I've always been raised with the knowledge that science is our friend, that all truth is God's truth, and to not fear questions like that. And so for me, when I was introduced to this way of reading the Bible that asked those kind of questions, it wasn't a stumbling block for me. It was very much a window into a new world, a way of a whole new area to explore. And I just fell in love with it. And so from there, I switched majors and became a religion major at the University of North Carolina, and then went and got a master's degree, Master of Divinity from Duke University, in Old Testament at Marquette. And so this really looking at Scripture, historical questions, asking literarians, diving into original languages, really reading it very closely, has been a very important part of my faith. That's in many ways that's the shape my faith has taken. The more I've learned about Scripture, the deeper my faith has become. And then the converse is also true. In kind of times in my life when I've kind of gotten away from that a little bit, I can tell that my faith feels a little dry, and so I know I need to get back and not just reading the Bible, but
Yeah,
studying it, finding a question to wrestle with.
yeah. That's very interesting. I always wonder um, when a person delves into the Old Testament the way you did. I'm sure that everything about faith, everything about the New Testament, everything just gets so colorful and meaningful, and it really gains a foundation to everything that we believe in. Is that correct?
Absolutely, that's certainly been my experience. When I spent a lot of time studying the Old Testament, and I found that the more I did that, whenever I would turn my eyes to the New Testament, I would. It was a richer world. It was
Mm-hmm.
there's the New Testament assumes the Old Testament. The New
Uh-huh, uh-huh.
built on the foundation of the Old Testament. So many of the themes in the New Testament, so many of the ways they talk about Jesus and what his life and death and resurrection meant, and so much of the ways they talk about what God is doing in the world in the New Testament is built on patterns, is built on themes, is built on ideas that we first see in the Old Testament. So
Yeah.
I very much think the New Testament is carrying forward a lot of ideas, certainly in a decisive way, but not in a way that's disconnected from the Old Testament.
Huh.
So what I have found is that one really great example that comes to mind just off the top of my head is the earliest chapters of Matthew. The very first pages of the New Testament. It's very clear that Matthew is connecting Jesus to the story of Israel, because Matthew begins with a genealogy, so it reaches right back into Jesus' past. But then also, the way Matthew tells the story of Jesus' birth, it presents Jesus and as a counterpart to the people of Israel, especially in the book of Exodus. And that's a resonance that's really easy to miss if you're not deeply familiar with the Old Testament story.
Huh. That is so. Yeah, I've always had a fascination about the Old Testament, and every time that I read one of those books, I'm feeling, as I'm reading it, I know that I'm missing so much. I know this, and that happens with the whole Bible, to be honest, at least for me. But with the Old Testament, as it were, I'm reading and I'm feeling this is so incredibly dense and rich. And you see, I see connections definitely, but I'm sure that, wow, with your experience, um, I'm sure that reading the Old Testament is just kind of a whole new world.
It really is, although there's still definitely things in there that are perplexing for me as well. Because it's scripture, it's the word of God, it's a
Yeah.
mystery, and so I think there's one of the reasons I got into studying it is because I was convinced, and I am still convinced, that you can't exhaust it. You can't find in there everything that there is to be found, because it is such a deep mystery. I will also say too, though, that what really helped me reading the Old Testament is to get a sense of the whole story from beginning to end. And to get a sense of the history of God's people in the Old Testament, from their earliest beginnings through the exile in Babylon and then their return from exile. Not everything in the Old Testament maps onto that, but most of it does. And so it's almost like once you got a hold of that, it's almost like you've got a roadmap. It's not, you don't have the answer to everything, but it's a little easier to know where you are and how everything relates to each other. So that's
Interesting.
so I
Well,
think
thank you.
that's been a gift. And whenever I teach the Bible, that's one of the first things I make sure to do is to give people that that roadmap, that skeleton, if you will,
Uh-huh.
around which you can build everything else.
Wow. Well, thank you for sharing that, Brian. Well, so today's question, God is love, but what about the Old Testament? I'll just share something quick about my faith. When I was an atheist, this was 7 years ago now, 8 years ago, I started reading the Bible for the first time, and I started reading about all other world religions. The thing that pushed me like very quickly to be in awe with Jesus was the Sermon of the Mount. That's truly an obsession of mine. But I remember when I started reading the Old Testament, and then I started seeing situations in Exodus, in Deuteronomy, in Joshua. There's several situations where I couldn't recognize God that well. And definitely now I can see in retrospective, I was having expectations as to what type of God I wanted to find, instead of just letting God reveal himself to me through scripture. But definitely with my conversations with my non-Christian friends, and this happened to me too, some people cannot recognize the God of the Old Testament, the God in the New Testament, in the Old Testament. And many people actually don't accept Christianity, or actually start considering Christianity as a worldview, because of this very question. This is a very serious question. So, I mean, in general, just as our first approximation to the question, what's your general view about this question? What do you think about this?
Yeah, definitely. It's a tough question. I've got a lot to say, but I'll start by affirming that the God we see in the Old Testament and the God we see in the New Testament is the same God. You know, it's one God. It's not one God in the Old Testament, one Testament. It's one God.
Mm.
God that the whole Bible witnesses to.
Mm.
One God that the whole Bible speaks a word about. Um, However, I will say that God is revealed most decisive in the person and work of Jesus Christ. So it's not the New Testament; it's the person of Jesus who we
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
still worship, still talk to in prayer, still meet when we receive communion. It's so so I don't want to just focus on Old Testament, New Testament, but think about the witness of Scripture
That's very good.
and the person of Jesus Christ and
Uh-huh.
our whole experience of Jesus in the church. So that's the first thing I would say. The other thing I would say um, is that within the Bible, um, I think the Old Testament gets read a lot less than the New Testament for many of the reasons you're mentioning. It's denser. It's a little harder to find your way around, and there are these violent passages where people do violent things in the name of God, where God commands those violent things, and where God Himself does violent things, like the plagues in Egypt. Um, but what often gets missed because of that are the places in the Old Testament that witness to God's deep love for all of humankind,
Mm.
witness to God's deep care for all of humankind and God's people Israel. And one of the places that comes to mind is the book of Jonah, where God tells Jonah, go to Nineveh, that great city, and prophesy against them. And so God sends Jonah, and of course Jonah doesn't want to do it, so he tries to run away, and he gets thrown overboard of the boat because God sends a storm. So that's, a violent act right there. God sends a storm to threaten this whole boat just because one guy is running away. But ultimately Jonah confesses to what he's done. They throw Jonah overboard at Jonah's own request, and then the storm calms down. And then a fish swallows Jonah, and then after 3 days, Jonah prays to God to essentially repenting and turning around. And so God tells the fish to spit Jonah back out, and then Jonah does go to Nineveh, where Jonah does prophesy against the city as God told him to do. And then the whole city repents, and God doesn't destroy the city. Jonah is the most successful prophet ever because the whole city repents. But then Jonah gets mad because he says, I look foolish because you said you were going to destroy this, and now you're not going to do it, and I like a liar. And God says, God gives Jonah a lesson where God says, I care about the people of Nineveh. And the message essentially is, I don't want to punish them. I want to spare them, and it's a good thing that I'm sparing them. So God voices God's deep care for the people of Israel. The book of Hosea is another place where the prophet Hosea speaks about God's relationship with Israel as a husband and wife relationship, and so it's full of emotion, where God speaks about God's pain of feeling betrayed, but also God's deep love, God's unwillingness to let Israel go.
Mm.
So there is this deep love in the Old Testament as well as in the New Testament. And then the flip side too is, I think sometimes we forget about violence that's in the New Testament as well.
Mm-hmm.
In the book of Matthew, Jesus tells the parable of the sheep and goats. And the goats, those who did not respond to their neighbors well, and therefore didn't respond to Jesus well when he came to them asking for food or clothing or drink, or when he was in prison, they're cast into outer darkness. And the phrases like weeping and gnashing of teeth, eternal fire, those are all New Testament ideas. You can actually trace development of thought about the afterlife through the Bible. You can see some of the earliest dated texts. It looks like a picture of the afterlife where you die and you've kind of got this shady existence, like kind of like the Greek Hades.
Yeah.
Versus in the New Testament, there's this idea of the resurrection of the dead that you can kind of see being developed over the course of the Old Testament, but it's really fully formed in the New Testament, where everyone will be resurrected, and some will be resurrected to life, and some will be resurrected to eternal punishment. And so my sort of joking way of saying this is that, well, at least in the Old Testament, God kills you and leaves you alone. In the New Testament, God throws you into a lake of fire forever. So which one is more violent, right? So part of what I like to do is to complicate the picture a little bit,
I see.
and to say New Testament does have very loving passages where God cares deeply and enters into a specific relationship with the people of Israel, because God cares so deeply for all of humankind. But then also in the New Testament, we don't like in the Old Testament, away from that just by bracketing off the Old Testament.
Hmm.
I'm sure I'm going, but
No, that is all very interesting. So, I'm just wondering, Brian, when, for example, this passage in the Bible, in the book of Joshua, when it states that Israel destroyed the people of Jericho, and it says that it destroyed both man, woman, young and old, and ox and sheep and donkey, completely wiping out babies. So when a Christian is reading the Old Testament, uh, how can one get to start understanding or approaching those passages? What would you say to someone reading those passages and are having trouble with them?
Yeah, great question. I think you've hit right on the heart of what is most troubling. Not just when violence happens, but when it happens at God's command to people who are clearly innocent, children. I think that's the exact heart of what it is. The first thing I would say is that I wrestle with that too. And I think anyone who reads a passage like that and is not troubled about it is not having the appropriate response. I think these passages are in there to trouble us. They are in there to make us wrestle, to make us. They're an invitation for deeper reflection. They're an invitation for us to see humanity in the other. I think that's an appropriate way to read them, to be challenged by them, to say, I'm not okay with this. And I think that's a perfectly appropriate response to the Old Testament. So I'm not about reading it in such a way that you make it okay, because reading passages like that are it's not okay, and it's okay to say that, I think.
Mm-hmm.
I will say though that So yeah, the first thing I want to do is just affirm that wrestling, affirm that visceral response that makes you want to turn away from it. I think that's appropriate. I will say though that it's hard for Christians today to read those passages in the same way that the ancient Jewish people would have read those passages, the ancient Israelite people would have read those passages. And a big reason for that is that the book of Joshua, for example, was written after, most likely it was written during the time shortly after the Babylonian exile. And the people of Israel had just returned from exile, and they were looking to establish themselves in the land again, but they were ruled by foreign rulers. The Persian Empire were the people in charge. Before that, about 50 years before that, they had been completely conquered, and many of them deported by the Babylonian Empire. So the people who were reading these texts, their earliest audience, were people who were not in a position of power. They were people who were very much a religious minority within their larger context, within the larger empire. And so they had a particular view of power that came from being on the bottom in terms of their social order. And we Christians in the United States today are by and large in a very different position of power. We are a religion that is we occupy a place of privilege
Wow.
in our world today. And so it's one thing to read about destruction and violence when you're in the position of power who is capable of exerting that violence. It's another thing to read it from a position of weakness where you're the people who are more likely to be on the receiving end of violence. Right? So it's very hard for us as Christians today to read those texts. When it's very hard for us as Christians today to read those texts with the same attitude, the same posture, the same feelings, the same experiences as the earliest audience.
Oh, interesting. Wow, I never thought
And
about that.
I think for them, it could be a way of imagining a role reversal, right? If they might be more likely to read narratives like that and feel less of a scandal than we feel today, because they're on the receiving end of it, and it's cathartic in a way to imagine the roles being reversed, right? So yeah, that's the other thing I'll say about that.
That is very interesting, Brian. I never heard that type of approach to it. I like this. So I've heard also some Christian thinkers and historians and theologians as well approaching this topic from the side of, okay, let's actually study the culture of the Canaanites and see what they were doing. And we end up talking about sacrificing babies to the cult of Molech or Molech, I don't know how to pronounce that well, and ways of living life that would actually surprise us even more than these passages in the Bible. And what do you think about that historical approach to study what was happening in order to compare to the moral conducts that then God wants to bring to it?
Yeah, I think that is a good approach too. I mentioned earlier the development of thought that you can trace in the Bible, and I think you can see that in a lot of other ways too. The Old Testament, if you take the earliest texts and the latest text, that the dates of those that are accepted by kind of a lot of biblical scholars, it's written over about 1,000-year period. The earliest texts seem to be written around about 1200 BC. It's very fuzzy. It's very hard to know anything, but the earliest texts could come from then or a little earlier. The latest texts were probably written around 167 or 163 BC. So you're looking at about 1,000 years roughly here. And the thought of the people of Israel changed over that time. It developed as they had encounters with the Canaanites and also the Babylonians and the Persians and then later the Greeks. And so part of that is that what you see in their theology and the way they thought about God actually had a lot in common with their Canaanite neighbors. Similar patterns. Just the idea of offering a sacrifice is one way to think about it. All the cultures around them had a way of offering sacrifices, and the ancient Israelites did too. So it was God saying, when you offer me a sacrifice, you're going to do it in this way, and you're going to offer it to me. Not, we're not going to offer sacrifices at all, right? And so some of it is that that was a common way of in the ancient Near East. A common way of looking at it is that God or the gods has commanded you to do this, and you're going to do that.
Okay.
So yeah, I think recognizing those the context that's there for the ancient Israelites and the ancient Israelite neighbors and the things in common that they share can be another way of taking a look at this material as well.
Interesting. What do you think, Brian, about this following approach? Um, I'm not sure if I have read about this or this is just me thinking about this. One thing I know is that I find myself thinking about this all the time. My mind goes to this following thought a lot, which is, um, why wouldn't God send his son Jesus at that time in history?
Mm,
And then he didn't. That we know. There was a particular time in history when Jesus just came to the world. So why didn't and why did he communicate and did he start a relationship that the way he did with the Israelites? And sometimes I think, is God adapting to the moral growth of our understanding of who he is, or is he another way to think about that, when he manifests himself, he's just doing breakthroughs, like this is something huge and now you need time to adapt to it, and now another something that is huge and then cries? Or is this kind of just more kind of God working through history, allowing people to be in a free will state of being, just being themselves while trying to start a relationship with them? What do you think about all that type of thinking?
Well, I think that that's actually a really good way to look at it. A
Mm.
really good question to ask. Honestly, I think it's a little bit of both.
Right.
That there is this this sense that our understanding of God changes as we learn more about God, as God speaks to us, and we grasp it imperfectly, and we need time, as you said, time to adapt and kind of time to get our heads around it. But then there are also these big breakthroughs, like something like the Exodus from Egypt, where God all of a sudden sets the people free, and there's this huge event, and there's a clear before and after. That's these decisive moments, the exile into Babylon and the return from exile is another, and then of course the ministry and life and death and resurrection of Jesus Christ is another. That where there are these big moments, these decisive breakthroughs, and then they have more major shifts of understanding. But in between those times, there's sort of ongoing reactions, ongoing reception of that. You almost need more than a generation to really understand the full implications of that for what God has revealed
Mm-hmm.
in those. So I think it's both. I think there's these big decisive events, but also this kind of ongoing evolution, if you will, of our understanding about God. Um, for the very reason that God is God and we are humans, and there's that big disconnect. And even when God speaks to us very clearly, there's some understanding that has to happen on our part. There's some translation that has to happen on our part
Uh-huh.
so that we can understand that well.
Hmm.
Um, I had something else I was going to say along those lines. Um, Speaking of being an imperfect human,
Yeah.
I just forgot about it. So
Oh, that is
maybe
okay.
I'll recall it in a
Yeah,
minute.
yeah. If it comes back to you, just you can interrupt me, okay? Feel free to do
Fair
that.
enough.
Um, yeah, something that is puzzling in a good way to me, Brian, as well, is that then in the Old Testament, you've mentioned very important passages where you can actually recognize uh, God's love. You could truly recognize it. There's one that I really like, and this is Ezekiel 33:11. I'll read it for you and um, the people that are watching. As surely as I live, declares the sovereign Lord, I take no pleasure in the death of the wicked, but rather that they turn from their ways and live. These are the type of verses sometimes that you find that, or for example, when he's punishing the Israelites, and while punishing them, you see this in the major prophets, I think. But I'm not good at quoting the Bible at this moment. I would like to get better in the future. But I've recognized, Brian, that at a certain point you read God saying directly, "I don't want sacrifices. I want mercy." Or he says, "In order to don't do this, you need to take care of widows." You need to take care of your neighbor, and you see that like as kind of the reasoning why he's punishing the Israelites. And then it makes you think like this is not as easy as a question, or as clear as a question as an answer, sorry, as it seems to be. What do you think about that?
No, I think that's right. So much of the things that are unsettling are in fact presented in the Old Testament as punishments.
Mm,
Right, like when God brings disaster on Israel, it's because God is punishing them either um, for apostasy, worshiping other gods, or frequently, as you mentioned in the prophets, it's because they're not ensuring that there's justice for widows and orphans and those who are vulnerable in their midst. And even in something like Joshua, where it's more about conquest, there is this sense, it's in the background, but it's there, that the reason God is commanding the Israelites to do this is because those other nations had offended God through their practices, and God is sending Israel to wipe them out. And the point of that is not to say, hey, Israel, look how good you are, but to say, hey, Israel, look what could happen to you if you don't obey me also.
mm,
If
mm.
you don't pursue justice, if you worship other gods, the same thing could happen to you as has happened to the nations you're dispossessing right now.
Huh.
So that's in there too. And I think that actually might be even more important than we realize in books like Joshua and Deuteronomy, where some of these things are commanded, is for the Israelites, it always comes back to their relationship with God. And so it's almost like God wants them to overhear that command, to as a caution to be careful, because if they don't obey God, that same thing could happen.
Hmm.
It doesn't make it any less unsettling. We don't like to think that God's hovering over us, ready to punish us with worldly disasters or violence or anything
Yeah.
like that. But there is a logic to it, that is consistent, um, in the
Yeah.
Old Testament. Yeah.
When Brian, when thinking about this topic too, something that comes to mind a lot, when having conversations again with my non-Christian friends, especially atheist friends, and they mentioned to me these difficult passages, difficult passages to understand. Um, it is very interesting because my mind naturally goes to Genesis, first chapter, when he's actually creating and saying that everything that he's creating is good,
Mm.
meaning this is the context. This is the whole context through which everything is happening. Then you see that there are bad things starting to happen in the world because humanity decides to move away from him. So at the theological level, if I don't know if I should put it this way, you help me. At least when I see passages like that, I always look at the Bible as what it is, like a whole picture of
Mm.
history. And then I realize, well, God didn't want that. When he created everything good. So we started to sin, and he's just trying to find ways through sin for us to get back to him. So truly the source of evil in the world is not God. If you just at first blush when reading the Bible, you see that he creates everything good. Is that a good approach to talk about this topic?
Yeah, I think so. And what I would add to that is that as God is working through sin, the God's moving in a direction. God's taking it somewhere, and where God is taking it is to a goal where there will also be no more sin. There will also be no more death. There will also be no
Mm-hmm.
more punishment. Christ came and conquered death. Christ came and conquered the grave. So it's not just the way things were in the beginning, and now we've deviated from that. It's also the way things are going to be in the end, and what God is ultimately bringing us towards.
Mm.
So yeah, I think that is a great approach to say, ultimately sin is originated with humankind and our propensity to disobey God, not just that original disobedience, that original sin, but our ongoing propensity to disobey and to turn away from God. which I think is not just our individual inclinations, but it's sort of our our inertia as a society, where we have structures around us that are sinful and encourage us to sin as well.
Uh-huh.
So
Go ahead.
no, yeah, I think that's those things. It's both and it's both our individual propensity to sin, but also our environment, our society around us that encourages that. Like racism. You know, that's in we have structures around us
Hmm.
that that make racism possible, and it's and make those effects possible. So it's more than just our individual inclinations. It's um, our structures around us too
Hmm.
that are sinful, and that God is working to eliminate all of that.
Yes. What happens, Brian, when I don't know if you went through this at any point in your life when considering this question? Um, because in my life, when I didn't believe in God, and then I looked around and I saw all the evil in the world in a world where God didn't exist, the evil didn't go away; it was there.
Mhm.
Now, so it didn't change anything that God didn't exist. I mean, there's evil there
Mhm.
and you need to deal with that. Now, it's very interesting because as of lately, not much. I really want to read more about this. In the philosophical side of things, I'm very interested in the problem of evil, the question of evil in the world. Um, uh, and I've been reading a little bit about genocides,
Mm.
just a little bit, not much. And Brian, I would love to hear your thoughts about this process of thinking, but I read a little bit about, I think it was an invasion of Japan in China in 1937. I think it has a proper noun. I don't remember what it is. And I'm sorry that I need to share this right now, but I want everyone to just acknowledge, I mean, where my thinking was going. I mean, something happens in this invasion, like soldiers were making parents to rape their own daughters
Mm.
while everyone was watching or dismembering them. Like this wasn't God. This
Mm.
wasn't God. This is not a verse. I mean, this is us. So there is something in us that is worse than what we. I mean, from a secular perspective, let's say, if I see what humanity does, and then I see those certain passages in the Bible that I don't like, at least what I know is that I wouldn't conclude that I should trust in moral humanity.
Mm.
I don't know if I should do that, to be fair with the things that I see around me. But I don't know. What do you think about that evil in the world when recognizing it in a world in which perhaps God doesn't exist and dealing with all of this?
You know, that's interesting that you phrase it in that way. You said evil doesn't go away
Yeah.
um, if God doesn't exist.
Hmm.
Where my mind goes is to say um, the things we call evil don't go away if God doesn't exist,
Hmm.
but the reality of good and evil is based on something that is higher than us.
Hmm.
And if God doesn't exist, then good and evil don't exist either.
Hmm.
The way I often phrase it is to say that the without God, the universe is frighteningly indifferent to human life.
Hmm.
All that bad stuff you were describing, if God doesn't exist, it doesn't even matter. You know, that's
Hmm.
because the world's going to go on spinning, and there's no goal, there's no trajectory to human life. There's suffering, but in the bigger picture, it's all going to go away because in a billion years it will have all been forgotten, long forgotten.
Yeah.
Um, and that it feels like a callous way of speaking when I say it that way.
Hmm.
And I think what that speaks to is that this sense of right and wrong, this sense of good and evil, is so ingrained within
Hmm.
us. And I believe that comes from God. I believe that our moral sensibility is a reflection of God's creation of us and God's placing within us a conscience. Um, and so for me, it's the existence of God or some sort of higher power that gives us the ability to even say this is right and this is wrong.
Hmm.
This is good and this is evil.
Yeah.
Um, because without it, we don't matter any more than rocks, and
Hmm.
that's a terrifying and sad
Yeah.
thought.
Yeah. You're definitely right. Well, Brian, this conversation has been fascinating. The Old Testament is always just a treasure to be discovered. And before we finish this conversation, I hope you don't mind. I would like to ask you just short questions in order to help people that are interested in understanding the Old Testament well. Just
Sure.
short questions. So, for example, if someone would say, I want to, perhaps this is a weird question, but if it's weird and it cannot be answered, you just tell me, Pedro, that's not a good question.
Best questions are weird questions.
So, if someone says, I would like to learn about the Old Testament, but I would like to read a book in the New Testament, like a gate or a door that would introduce me well to the Old Testament, what is the book that you would tell people to read in the New Testament in order to start understanding what the Old Testament is trying to communicate to us?
Oh wow, that is a good question. If I had to pick one in the New Testament to do that, I would probably pick Matthew or Hebrews, one of those
Oh,
two.
oh,
Hebrews is definitely addressing the Old Testament directly,
yeah.
but because it's doing that, uh, Hebrews is sort of putting its own framework on the Old Testament, if you will.
Mm, mm,
But Matthew is telling the story of Jesus uh, as a direct continuation of the Old Testament, and Matthew is pretty clear about spelling out um, when Jesus did this, it fulfilled this part of the Old Testament, and
mhm,
here's why. So Matthew uses these formula quotations to say, "Thus was fulfilled what was spoken by the prophet," and then a direct quotation.
mm.
So very clearly calling out places of correspondence between Jesus's life and the Old Testament and the Gospel of Matthew. That would be the place to start
Cool.
if you had to start with the New Testament book. But I would say start with.
Nice. So, what is like the same question turned on itself? So, if someone would like to understand the New Testament better and wants to read one or two books from the Old Testament that would help them understand better this New Testament, what books in the Old Testament would help us do that?
So that's a harder question.
I can see that.
Yeah, that's a harder question because the Old Testament tells a story that's there are only a there's very few places. I can't really think of any places that tell that whole story in one book.
Mhm.
Uh, First and Second Chronicles kind of do that together, but there's a lot that they leave out.
I see.
Um, but then the other thing though is the New Testament itself looks back to a couple of books more than others. One of those is Isaiah.
Mm.
Um, Jesus quotes Isaiah a lot. The other New Testament writers quote Isaiah a lot. The Psalms is another one that shows up a lot in the New Testament. Um, and in the book of Genesis, it seems like the way the epistle writers talk about the significance of Jesus' death and resurrection. They're saying Jesus is fixing a problem that was introduced in Genesis,
Mm,
and
mm.
so that's another place. So I think I gave you 4 or 5 there instead
Yes,
of just one. But
that's okay.
that's an interesting question. That's a harder one to answer for
Yeah,
a
I
lot of reasons.
understand. So my last question for you, Brian, I'm so thankful for you. But having a Old Testament PhD with me, I just don't want to miss asking this question. So in the Christian non-Christian conversation and people wanting to read the Bible, and one of the biggest challenges for many people, I would say, is the few first chapters of Genesis. now, they read the chapters. There might be an expectation that we should read them in a literal fashion. Then there's another tradition. No, this is symbolic, but actually saying truth in a metaphorical way. Then there are other traditions trying to merge everything that we have discovered through the tools and the empirical method and science with what we see in the Old Testament. What can you shed a little bit of light as to the way you would approach this as an expert on Old Testament reading and studying? What would you do? What's your thought about that topic?
So you're asking about the first
Creation, the creation
chapter.
account. Yeah, the creation accounts. Yeah.
Yeah. So for me, I definitely tend to fall in the camp of the accounts in Genesis are more metaphorical. They're telling the story in a way that makes clear that God is the creator,
Mm-hmm.
and that helps us as readers see what God values in creation and what we are to value in creation.
Hmm.
So and the way that I approach that, especially in the first chapter of Genesis, I think you can see it a little bit in all three. So you've got actually two different creation stories in the first three chapters. You've got
Mm-hmm.
Genesis chapter 1 and the first couple verses of chapter 2, and then the rest of chapter 2 and chapter 3. They're
Mm-hmm.
all two distinct stories. But in the first chapter, you see features of Hebrew poetry. There is repetition. There's use of more elevated language that's a little bit rarer in later parts of the Old Testament. And there's a clear structure. There's this 7-day structure, and you can actually see how the first 3 days correspond with the second 3 days, and then there's the seventh day, the Sabbath, that sort of stands on its own as a culmination. And all of that, to me and to a lot of other readers, suggests that what we're dealing with in the first chapter of Genesis is more like poetry than like prose. It's more like poetry than history or science. And so if it's more like poetry, we read it wrong unless we read it like poetry.
Yeah.
And so when I read a poem, I'm not looking for a factual account. I'm looking for something that helps me penetrate to deeper truth about the world. That's a little bit more artistic. That's a little bit more impressionistic. And I think that's the way I approach the first chapter of Genesis. And then in a little bit different way, the second and third chapters of Genesis. Those aren't poetry, but they are in the same way. They're more like imagery. They're more like pictures. They're more like metaphors. I'm not sure I like the word metaphor so much for that. The other word you'll hear in biblical scholarship is mythology. That's got a lot of other baggage that I don't like. I think it's a good word if you understand the scholarly nuance that they place on it, but it's got a lot of popular baggage that makes it not so helpful. So I don't like to call it myth. But there's these things that speak to deep truths of the human condition, and showing how those deep truths of the human condition affect our relationship with God, and how God is speaking to those deep truths of the human condition. I think that's what's going on. And again, so if you ask me when was the world created, I'm going to say 13 point something billion years ago in a big bang. But if you ask me why the world was created, and how I'm supposed to live in light of that, I'm going to point you to Genesis chapters 1 and 3. 1 to 3.
Well, that is Brian. Thank you very much for spending time with me today. This was kind of a surprise, these last questions, but I just didn't want to miss the opportunity. I hope you didn't mind.
Not at all. I always appreciate an opportunity to talk about the Old Testament. We are all fellow learners. And so I appreciate the opportunity to learn together with you and with your viewers about all this. This is always fascinating to me, and I appreciate the opportunity to join you today.
Well, thank you, Brian. And everyone who is watching, as you know, if you would like to contact me, you can do it by sending an email to askandwondernashville@gmail.com, and you have all this information below. And definitely this, if you would like to listen to this episode as a podcast episode, you can do that. And also if you go to iTunes or Google Play, you will find Ask and Wonder in the search bar, and you'll see the episode with Brian Sigmon. And thank you very much, everyone, for being here and for your support on Patreon. Thank you very much, Brian, for spending time with us today. And I'll see you guys next time.